The Vietnam War, which was the longest war the US was involved in, was, in essence, a war fought to stop communism in Asia, and ultimately worldwide. But what exactly led up to the war? On December 19, 1946, colonial French forces, supported by Cambodia, Laos, the US, and the state of Vietnam, began opposing an uprising of the Viet Minh forces, led by Ho Chi Minh. This ordeal would come to be known as the First Indochina War. A little under a month prior, the CEFEO, the French Far East Expeditionary Forces, engaged in the first bombing battle with the Viet Minh at Hai Phong, with 6,000 civilian deaths. The Viet Minh called a ceasefire and retreated.
On December 19th, the war formally began, with 30,000 Viet Minh soldiers attacking the French at Hai Phong, known as the Battle of Hanoi. The Viet Minh eventually withdrew, marking a win for the French. A year later, on October 7, 1947, French forces enacted Operation Lea against the Viet Minh, which were coordinated strikes on Viet Minh strongholds, killing 9,000 Viet Minh. However, many still escaped. On March 8, 1949, the French recognized the independent state of Vietnam, led by Emperor Bao Dai, with the newly formed Chinese Republic recognizing Ho Chi Minh's Vietnam a year later. This same year, China began supplying the Viet Minh with ghee, and due to this, America recognized the French-backed state of Vietnam.
December 22, 1951 marked the first ever use of napalm in warfare. On January 1951, 20,000 Viet Minh launched a series of offensives on French positions, and by the end of the year, French casualties exceeded 90,000, but support for the war was still strong.
On March 15, 1954, the Viet Minh launched the assault of Dien Bien Phu, with around 50,000 Viet Minh destroying guns, artillery, and airships. By May 7th, with no military backup, 10,000 French forces surrendered, with 8,000 Viet Minh dead and 1,500 French dead. In the months of May to June, these surrendering French forces were transported 700 kilometers away to camps, where half would later die. On July 20th, the Geneva Accords divided up Vietnam at the 17th parallel, based on a model of the armistice that ended the Korean War a year prior. America and South Vietnam refused to sign.
In October of that year, Ho Chi Minh returned to North Vietnam after 8 years of exile to take control. Bao Dai is appointed Prime Minister of South Vietnam, with around 1 million North Vietnamese fleeing to the south.
This theory worried the Western world, who were engaging in the Cold War, which was a fight for either capitalism or communism to become the global ideology. It is named the Cold War due to the build-up of nuclear weapons and the fact that none were dropped on either country. This theory was used primarily by the United States in order to justify US involvement in stopping communism around the world.
Diem launched many anti-communist campaigns, where it is estimated that 25,000 activists were arrested for their support of communism. As Ngo Diem became more and more unpopular, the Viet Cong was formed, otherwise known as the National Liberation Front. He requested assistance from America and their allies, and in doing so, the Australian Army Training Team in Vietnam was formed, and sent 30 to 227 advisors over the entire duration of the war. As Diem was under pressure, his capabilities proved that he was not the right person for the job, and Americans were under suspicion that he was working with Ho Chi Minh. Diem and his brother Nhu was assassinated on November 2nd, 1963, in order to overthrow his government.
In 1961, a team sent by then President John F. Kennedy to report on the conditions of South Vietnam advised the build-up of US forces, economic aid, and technical aid in order to help the leader of South Vietnam, who at the time was Diem, to oppose the growing Viet Cong forces. The US's plan followed the domino theory, and because of this, Kennedy steadily increased US aid, and by 1962, there were 9,000 troops stationed in Vietnam. On the 22nd of November 1963, John F. Kennedy was shot dead, and his political successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, and Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, were persuaded by the political instability of Vietnam to further increase US aid.
In August of 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which the legitimacy of is highly debated, occurred with DRV torpedo boats, 2 US destroyers, with President Johnson launching retaliatory bombings in North Vietnam, with the US Congress passing the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, effectively meaning that Johnson had war-making powers. Regular bombings of North Vietnam ensued, known as Operation Rolling Thunder. In 1965, with solid support of US citizens, US troops were sent to fight in Vietnam.
In early 1960s, support for South Vietnam was in keeping policies that stopped the spread of communism in Asia. In 1961 and 62, Australia dispatched its first military advisors from the AATTV at the request of South Vietnamese. Their arrival in 1962 marked the beginning of Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War. In 1964, the RAAF sent Caribou aircraft transporters to bases in South Vietnam. In early 1965, it was clear that South Vietnam would not be able to fight off the impending communist invasion, and when the major escalation of US troops occurred, the US government requested the help of Australian and New Zealand forces, among others.
This is because of the ANZUS Treaty. The ANZUS Treaty is a security agreement between Australia, the USA, and New Zealand to cooperate in military matters in the Pacific Ocean, but later international matters. It was formed in 1951. The treaty provides that if any one of these countries is attacked, then the others should respond in fight to the common threat. In case of the Vietnam War, America was supposedly attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin, sparking a response by New Zealand and Australia.
The first US strike in Vietnam occurred in August of 1965 with the commencement of Operation Starlight, where 5,500 US Marines struck the 1st Viet Cong Regiment. Both sides claimed victory, with the US claiming they only suffered 45 casualties, whereas the Viet Cong supposedly suffered 614. The combined arms assault was based on intel provided by an ARVN commander. Lieutenant General Louis Walt devised this plan to be a preemptive strike against the Viet Cong in order to nullify the increasing threat at Khoury Air Base to ensure the communications tower was kept intact.
The first major event in which Australia was involved in was the Battle of Long Tan, which took place over one night from the 18th to the 19th of August in 1966 in the Phuoc Toi province of South Vietnam. It was between primarily Australian forces who were bombarded by Viet Cong forces in the newly formed base in Nui Dat. In response to the attack, Australian forces from the B Company and the 6th Battalion were directed to locate Viet Cong firing positions. After this, they were replaced by the D Company of the same battalion, who followed Viet Cong tracks to a rubber plantation towards the abandoned village of Long Tan. It was at this plantation that the battle occurred, with 108 Australian men colliding with a major concentration of up to 2,500 Viet Cong men. This battle is arguably the most recognised battle in which the Anzac forces were directly involved, and by the end of the battle, 18 Australians were dead, and up to 350 Viet Cong were dead. The Battle of Long Tan is now widely remembered as a display of the Anzac attributes of bravery, teamwork, and endurance despite all odds. The rest of the war that followed would go down as one of the longest, most costly and divisive wars in history, and lead to the deaths of 1.3 to 4.3 million people over its course. The First Indochina War would prove to be crucial to the start of the war, and the battles that ensued would go on to mould the battles that followed during the rest of the war.